The snowstorm howled through the night, biting into the bones of everything caught in its path. The rancher, his hands cold and his face weathered from years of hard work under the unforgiving sky, had just finished his chores and was heading back to his cabin. His horse trotted slowly through the thickening snow, a familiar sound in the dark. Suddenly, a faint scream pierced through the howling wind, a scream so desperate it seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the storm. He tugged the reins, slowing his horse, straining to hear over the wind. Another scream. The rancher's heart skipped a beat, and before he even realized it, he had spurred his horse forward, racing toward the sound. The snowstorm was brutal, relentless, and unforgiving. The wind cut through the air like a knife, swirling the snow in all directions, reducing the landscape to nothing but an endless, blinding white. Yet, despite the chaos of the storm, the rancher's sharp eyes caught a silhouette of figure stumbling through the snow, struggling to stay upright. A woman. Her face was barely visible through the thick layers of snow that clung to her clothing. Her body hunched against the cold as she fought to move forward. The rancher's instincts kicked in, and without hesitation he pulled his horse to a stop, dismounted quickly, and ran toward her. The woman's face was pale, her lips blue from the cold. Her eyes were wide with fear, barely able to focus through the blizzard. She didn't speak, she couldn't. Her breath came in sharp gasps, her body trembling uncontrollably from the freezing temperatures. She tried to speak, but her voice was lost in the wind. The rancher wasted no time. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her towards him with surprising strength. Guiding her through the snow to the safety of his horse, he threw a coat over her shoulders, trying to shield her from the biting cold, all the while wondering who this woman was and why she was out in this storm. But the question would have to wait. His first priority was survival. As the two of them made their way back to the ranch, the wind howled louder, as if protesting their efforts to escape its fury. The rancher, his mind racing with questions, couldn't help but notice the woman's utter silence. She didn't make a sound as they rode through the snowstorm, not even a cry of relief or gratitude. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, her hands gripping the rancher's coat with a tension that suggested something more than just fear of the storm. It was as if she were trying to escape something deeper, something that went beyond the blizzard itself. When they finally arrived at the ranch, the storm had reached its peak. The wind slammed against the wooden walls of the house, rattling the windows and shaking the foundations. The rancher hurried the woman inside, hoping that warmth and shelter would be enough to bring her back from the brink of unconsciousness. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a fire already crackling in the hearth. He placed her near the fire, removing her wet clothing as carefully as he could, his mind still racing. Who was she? Why was she out there, alone, in the middle of a blizzard? The questions burned in his mind, but he knew they would have to wait until she was well enough to answer them. The woman barely acknowledged him as he worked, her gaze distant and unfocused. It was clear she was in shock, but what was most unsettling was the deep, unspoken fear that clung to her every move. Her silence was oppressive, almost as if she were trying to block out everything around her. The rancher couldn't help but feel a growing unease, unsure if he had done the right thing by bringing her into his home. He had a duty to help, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. As the fire crackled in the hearth, the rancher sat back watching the woman closely. He had no idea who she was, what brought her to his doorstep, or why she seemed so intent on avoiding him. His instincts told him there was more to this than a simple case of being lost in a snowstorm. Yet, he couldn't ignore the fact that she was there alive and in need of help. For now, that was all that mattered. But something told him that his night was far from over, and the mystery of the woman would soon unfold in ways he could never have imagined. The storm outside intensified, but inside the cabin there was only the quiet crackle of the fire and the weight of the ranchers. Thoughts he could no longer ignore, the sense of unease that lingered in the air. The woman had come to him for a reason, and though he didn't yet understand it, he knew his life would never be the same. In the stillness of the moment, he realized that saving her from the storm was just the beginning. The real question was whether he could help her survive the storm that had clearly been following her for much longer than the blizzard. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls of the small ranch house. The rancher worked quickly, pulling off his wet clothing and starting a pot of coffee to warm them both. The woman sat by the fire, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling as if still caught in the grip of the storm. Her eyes were wide, lost, and unfocused, as though the world around her had yet to come back into sharp focus. The rancher didn't push her to speak, though the silence between them felt heavy. Every time he glanced at her, his mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where was she from? And why was she out in the storm? Despite the warmth of the fire, the woman seemed to grow colder by the minute. She didn't respond to him, her gaze locked on the flames. He set the coffee aside, moving toward the guest room with a blanket in hand. It was clear that she needed rest, but something about her posture, the way she clung to herself, told him that rest wasn't all she needed. She was in shock, no doubt, but there was something else, a deeper weariness in her. When he spoke to her softly, asking if she wanted to lie down, she finally looked at him, her voice barely audible. A room in absolute silence. She murmured. The request, so simple yet strange, caught him off guard. But he didn't hesitate. He nodded quietly, making his way to the guest room and setting the blanket on the bed. He'd never had a guest like this before, someone so broken, so distant, and yet so in need of comfort. The room was sparsely furnished. A small bed, a wooden chair, and a few shelves of books and trinkets he had collected over the years. It was simple, humble, but it would do. As he turned to leave, the woman's voice broke the silence again, softer this time. "Please, no noise," she whispered, almost pleading. He nodded again, his brow furrowing in confusion, but he understood. She wanted peace. She wanted quiet to sort through whatever thoughts were racing through her mind. The rancher stepped back into the main room, leaving the door slightly ajar in case she needed him. He sat near the fire, the crackling logs providing the only sound in the otherwise still house. The absence of conversation felt almost unnatural, and he could feel the weight of the silence in the air. It was as though every moment stretched, longer than it should, each second pulling at the threads of his curiosity. He wanted to ask her questions, to understand who she was and why she had been out there in the storm. But her request for silence had been so urgent, so firm, that he couldn't bring himself to break it. The rancher understood the importance of silence. He had spent years living alone in this remote place. But this silence felt different as the hours passed. The rancher tried to occupy himself with small tasks, cleaning up his gear, checking on the horses in the barn, making sure the fire stayed strong. But every time his mind wandered, it circled back to her, the woman who had appeared out of nowhere, cold and lost. He wondered about her life, her story, the events that had led her to him. She had asked for silence, and he had given it to her, but the silence itself was consuming. It made him uneasy, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. What had happened to her that made her seek refuge in such a peculiar way? Outside, the storm had finally started to settle, the winds lessening their fury. But the rancher remained alert, his senses heightened. It wasn't just the storm that worried him now, it was her. The woman who had crossed his path and shaken the stillness of his life. He couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something he wasn't being told. He respected her request, but the tension was building inside him. He couldn't simply stand by and let her remain a mystery. He needed to know if she was truly safe, if the danger had passed. But for now, he sat in silence, waiting. Time seemed to stretch endlessly in the quiet house. The rancher's thoughts drifted between the fire, the horses, and the woman in the guest room. He had learned to appreciate solitude. Years of living alone had taught him the value of peace and stillness, but this was different. This silence was fraught with anticipation, as if something important was just beyond reach, hidden in the shadows. The rancher could feel it, the weight of something unspoken, something the woman was carrying. Whatever it was, it had led her to his doorstep in the middle of a blizzard, and though she had asked for silence, the silence itself screamed louder than any words could as the night wore on. He began to wonder if the silence was not just for her benefit, but for his as well. It felt as though the space between them had to be preserved, as if the unspoken words were too powerful to be released just yet. He didn't want to invade her space, but he couldn't help but feel that this was the calm before the storm. Whatever had driven her to him would soon come to light. And in that moment, the rancher realized that silence wasn't merely the absence of noise. It was a shield, a barrier against the truth that neither of them was yet ready to face. The rancher knew that tomorrow would bring answers. The rancher sat by the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames as the night deepened. The woman in the guest room had finally drifted into a fragile sleep, her breathing slow and steady, but there was a distance in her stillness and emptiness that seemed to cling to her like the snow on the ground outside. As he stared into the fire, his mind began to drift, pulled back into memories of his own life. The West had not been kind to him, and he had learned early that survival required a certain hardness, a willingness to bury pain beneath the daily grind. But now, with the woman in his home, those old scars began to resurface. His thoughts returned to the long winters when he was younger, a time when the isolation of his ranch had been his only company. He remembered the snowstorm that nearly took his life. It had been a fierce storm, one that seemed to appear out of nowhere, swallowing the land in a blanket of white. He had been caught in it, out on the far side of the ranch, trying to bring the cattle back into the barn. He could still feel the biting cold, the way the wind tore at his skin and froze his bones, blinding him. He had fought to stay conscious, stumbling through the snow, but the cold had nearly claimed him. In the end, it was the sheer will to survive that kept him going. It had been close, too close, and the memory of that night haunted him still. The warmth of the fire in the cabin did little to dispel the chill that ran down his spine. He had been alone for so long that the weight of his memories didn't have to compete with anyone else's, but now, with the woman's quiet presence in the house, those memories began to stir in new ways. Her silence reminded him of his own, in solitary existence. But there was something else in her eyes, something dark and painful that he couldn't quite understand. As he thought about her, he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't just another lost soul caught in the storm. She had come to him for a reason, and that reason was buried deep beneath the surface. As the hours stretched on, the rancher's mind wandered again, this time to the time he had spent in the town before retreating to his ranch. His life had been marked by loss, one tragedy after another, each one stripping away the idealistic dreams he once had. His father's death had been the first blow, the event that forced him to take on the responsibilities of the ranch too soon. But the real turning point had been his wife's departure. She had left without warning, taking their young daughter with her. It had been the silence of that loss, the unanswered questions, the things he could never say that had driven him to seek refuge in the isolation of his land. Now, as he stared into the fire, those memories seemed to bleed into one another. The rancher had spent so long trying to bury the past that it took everything in him not to drown in the flood of emotions that threatened to overtake him. He wondered if the woman's silence, her request for peace, was born of a similar pain. She seemed to be holding on to something, as though she were afraid to speak, afraid to give voice to the secrets that lurked behind her eyes. And yet, the rancher couldn't help but feel drawn to her, as though her suffering was somehow intertwined with his own. It was in the quiet of that night, surrounded by his memories and the weight of the woman's unspoken words, that the rancher realized something. He was no longer simply helping her. He was beginning to understand her. The storm that had brought her to him, the cold that had threatened to take her life, were just the surface. She had a past, one that was as dark and heavy as his own, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. The rancher leaned back in his chair, his thoughts turning inward as he listened to the wind howl outside. The woman was a mystery, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized she was more than just a victim of circumstance. She had lived through something terrible, something that had shaped her in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. His own past had left him with scars that never fully healed, and he felt a strange kinship with her. A bond forged in the shared pain of the West. As the night wore on, the rancher's mind was filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. What had happened to the woman? What had driven her into the storm, alone, seeking refuge in a place as desolate as this? He didn't know yet, but he could feel it in his bones. Whatever it was, it had the power to change everything. Just like his own past, it was a force that would shape their futures in ways they couldn't yet understand. And as the fire burned low, he knew that the woman's silence held the key to unlocking the mystery. But first, he would have to be ready to face his own darkness. The woman stirred slowly as the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's small windows. The rancher had already been awake for some time, tending to the fire and preparing a simple meal for her. He watched her carefully as she blinked against the bright morning, her face still pale and drawn. She didn't speak at first, only looked around the room as if trying to remember where she was. When her gaze finally met his, she said softly, almost as if it pained her to speak, "I'm hungry." Her voice was hoarse from the cold, but the rancher didn't hesitate. He set the meal in front of her, hoping that some food might bring back a semblance of normalcy. But even as she took the food, there was an air of something unresolved hanging in the room. She ate in silence, barely making a sound except for the occasional sip of the coffee he had brewed for her. The rancher stayed across the room, watching her, waiting for any sign that she might say something, anything that could give him a glimpse into her life. But she didn't speak, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each action required more energy than she had left to give. She was distant, lost in her thoughts, and the silence between them grew more uncomfortable by the second. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him, the tension building with each passing moment. He wanted to ask her questions, to understand what had brought her to him, but something held him back. She wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. After a long moment, the woman looked up at him again, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of uncertainty and something deeper, something guarded. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I just need quiet." The rancher nodded, respecting her request once more, but the silence began to gnaw at him. He could feel his own curiosity bubbling up, and he had to fight the urge to press her for answers. There was a storm of emotions in her, fear, pain, something darker, and he was caught between his growing need to help her and the fear that what she was hiding might be more dangerous than he was ready to face. The quiet hung thick in the air, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. The rancher leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming restlessly on the armrest. His thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of her, trying to figure out what she was running from. It was clear now that she was not just a victim of a snowstorm. There was something much bigger behind her fear, something that had pushed her to the brink of survival. His mind churned with possibilities, none of them good. She had come to him for refuge, but he wondered if he had unknowingly brought trouble into his home. Was she being pursued? And if so, by whom? A sudden movement from her broke his thoughts. She set down her empty bowl and turned toward him, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "I didn't want to get anyone involved," she said softly, almost apologetically, "but I don't know how much longer I can keep running." Her words sent a shiver down the rancher's spine. There it was, the truth, finally slipping through her silence like a crack in a dam. She wasn't just fleeing a storm or seeking shelter from the cold. She was running from something much darker, something that threatened her very life. And in that moment, the rancher felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The woman's gaze flickered down to her hands, her fingers trembling as she clasped them together in her lap. "There are people," she continued, her voice low. "People who won't stop until they find me. She trailed off, biting her lip as if struggling to find the right words. The rancher felt his heart tightened in his chest. He had heard enough over the years: whispers, rumors, stories of men and women running from the law, from crime families, from debts that could never be paid. But this was different. Her fear was too raw, too real, and whatever she was fleeing, it was close, much closer than he had thought. The tension in the room thickened as the weight of her words settled over him. The rancher knew that his desire to protect her, to offer her safety, now carried a heavy cost. His life, his home, everything he had worked for was now entangled in a web of danger that he hadn't signed up for. But the woman's vulnerability, the fragility in her eyes, pulled at something deep inside him. He couldn't turn her away, not now. Not when she was this close to breaking. But he also knew that helping her meant stepping into a world of trouble that he may not be able to escape. He leaned forward, his voice low, steady. "You're safe here as long as you need." He wasn't sure if he believed it himself, but it was the only promise he could make. The woman didn't respond immediately, but he saw the faintest flicker of relief in her eyes. It was enough to keep him going. The road ahead would be treacherous. He could feel it in his bones. But the rancher had already made his choice. Whatever her past held, he couldn't turn his back on her, not now. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls of the cabin. As the rancher sat near the fire, unable to shake the sense of unease that had settled over him, the night had been unusually quiet, save for the occasional crack of wood in the fire, but something felt off. The silence was too thick, too heavy. His instincts, honed over years of living alone in the wilderness, were telling him that something was wrong. Then, through the night's stillness, he heard heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow outside. His heart skipped a beat as he froze, every muscle tensing. The sound came closer, unmistakable. Someone was approaching his home. He stood up quickly, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle resting against the wall. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were no stranger. They moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. The rancher's pulse quickened, and for a moment, he considered waking the woman. But then he hesitated. What if it was someone she had been running from? What if this was part of the danger she had spoken of? The last thing he wanted was to put her at risk by alerting her too soon. Instead, he moved quietly to the window, peeking through the gaps in the heavy curtains. His eyes scanned the snow-covered ground outside, the pale moonlight casting long shadows across the landscape. There was no sign of anyone standing by the door, no one visible at the edge of the porch. For a moment, he thought he might have imagined it, that his mind had played tricks on him in the quiet of the night. But then, his breath caught as he saw a series of boot prints in the snow leading up to his cabin. They were fresh, the edges still crisp, and they trailed around the ranch. As if someone had circled the building, searching for an entry. The rancher's heart sank. Someone had been here looking for her. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a passing traveler or a curious wanderer. Someone had followed her, tracked her to this place. The rancher's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. The woman, the secrecy, the fear in her eyes, it all started to make sense. She wasn't just fleeing from some abstract danger. This was real. Whoever was looking for her would stop at nothing to find her. And now, they were here, on his land, threatening everything he had built. The weight of the situation settled over him like a thick fog, and he knew there was no turning back now. The time for quiet waiting had passed. With a deep breath, he stepped back from the window, his eyes scanning the room. He knew he had to act fast. If the men outside were coming for her, he couldn't afford to hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, checked the ammunition, and made his way to the door. The rancher didn't know who these men were, but he knew he couldn't let them get to her. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the air in the cabin thick with tension. His heart was racing, but his mind was clear. He had to protect the woman, no matter the cost. The danger was here, and there was no way to avoid it. Outside, the storm had started to pick up again, the wind whipping the snow into a frenzy. The rancher moved silently through the house, checking every window, every corner, making sure he was ready for whatever came next. He knew that the men outside might have the advantage in numbers, but he had something they didn't. He knew this land better than anyone, and he had spent years surviving the harshest conditions the West could throw at him. He had faced worse odds before, but this was different. This was personal. The silence outside stretched on, broken only by the sound of the storm and the crunch of snow underfoot. The rancher's mind raced as he considered his options. Should he confront them directly, or should he wait, hoping they would move on? He knew waiting wasn't an option. The longer he delayed, the greater the risk to her safety. He had to make a decision, and soon. His hand tightened around the rifle as he moved toward the door, preparing for the worst. The men were out there, and he had no intention of letting them take her. With one final glance toward the guest room where the woman slept, the rancher took a deep breath and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, biting through his clothes, but he hardly felt it. His focus was singular now. He would protect her, no matter the cost. As he moved silently through the snow, every step deliberate, the rancher knew that his life was about to change forever. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break, and he was ready to face it head-on. The night was unusually still when the rancher heard the soft creak of the cabin door. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he was on his feet in an instant, moving silently toward the source of the sound. There, standing in the doorway of the guest room, was the woman. She was dressed in her coat, her eyes wide with panic. She was trying to leave. The rancher approached her quietly, his voice firm but calm as he said, "You can't go out there, not in this storm." She looked at him with desperation in her eyes, as if the storm outside was less frightening than whatever had driven her to this point. "I have no choice," she whispered, almost to herself. The rancher's heart clenched as he saw the fear in her eyes. She was running from something, but what? The cold of the night had nothing on the chill in the room as the woman stood there, was shaking, as though the act of leaving was a final attempt at escape. But the rancher knew it wasn't just the storm she feared, it was something much worse. "You're not going anywhere," he said gently but firmly, stepping closer to her. She didn't resist, but the sadness in her eyes spoke volumes. She was caught in a web of fear, and the rancher was the only thing standing between her and whatever danger lay outside. The rancher knew he couldn't let her go out there alone, not with the storm still raging, not with the men he had seen, lurking in the snow. There was no telling how far those men had gone, how close they might be. As the woman reluctantly agreed to stay, the rancher made a promise to himself he would protect her no matter the cost. He stayed up through the night, watching over her, unable to shake the feeling that things were escalating far beyond his control. The sense of danger that had begun as a whisper was now a roar in his mind, and he had no idea what to expect when morning came. At first light, the rancher went about his morning routine, but his thoughts were elsewhere, constantly drifting back to the woman's terrified expression and her strange, cryptic words. Then, as if on cue, two men appeared on horseback, riding up to the ranch just as the storm began to subside. The rancher watched them from the window, his hand instinctively resting on the rifle. They were both rugged-looking, dressed in weathered coats and wide-brimmed hats. They dismounted and approached the cabin with purpose. When they knocked, the rancher opened the door slowly, his eyes scanning them for any hint of threat. The men claimed to be relatives of the woman, asking if she was inside. Their words were smooth, their demeanor calm, but something about them didn't sit right with the rancher. The way they glanced at each other, the way they tried too hard to remain casual, told him they were hiding something. He didn't know who they were, but he could feel their presence pressing in on him. "I haven't seen her," the rancher replied coolly, locking eyes with the taller of the two. The men exchanged a brief look, their eyes narrowing ever so slightly, but they didn't push the issue further. Instead, they asked if they could search the property, claiming they had come a long way and were worried about her safety. The rancher's mind raced. He couldn't let them search the cabin. He couldn't reveal the woman's location without putting her in danger. His protective instincts flared, and he found himself standing his ground, despite the tension in the air. "I told you, I haven't seen her," he repeated, his voice calm but resolute. There was a long pause, the men sizing him up, as if trying to decide whether to push the matter or walk away. Finally, after a long moment, the men exchanged another silent look, and the taller one nodded. "We'll be on our way," he said, turning his back. The rancher watched them mount their horses, but the doubt in his mind had only grown. As the men rode off, the rancher couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Why had they come looking for her? Who were they really? His suspicion grew by the second, but the woman remained hidden, silent in the guest room, oblivious to the confrontation that had just taken place. The rancher's mind spun with questions. He couldn't answer. What kind of danger was she running from? And more importantly, why had she lied to him about her past? Was it possible that the truth was far darker than he could have imagined? The men were gone, but the sense of unease remained, lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. That afternoon, the rancher went about his chores, but his thoughts were consumed by the strange encounter. The doubt gnawed at him, the questions mounting. Who were those men? What were they really after? And most importantly, why hadn't the woman told him the whole truth? He couldn't help but feel like he had been dragged into something far bigger than he had ever anticipated. He had promised to protect her, but the truth was, he didn't even know who she really was. The rancher's moral dilemma grew heavier with each passing hour. He had no answers, only more questions, and the fear that he was playing a dangerous game with forces far beyond his understanding. As the days passed, the tension between the rancher and Maggie continued to grow, thickening the air with every glance exchanged, every moment of silence. He could sense the burden she carried, but she remained closed off, unwilling to share more than she already had. The weight of her secret pressed down on him, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. Every time he looked at her, there was a flicker of something to her pain, a sorrow that she tried desperately to hide. But the time for silence was nearing its end. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Maggie finally broke the silence. She looked at him, her eyes haunted, as if she had made a decision. "My name is Maggie," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The rancher's heart skipped a beat. After all the days of silence, the weight of her name seemed to carry more than just identification. It was the first step toward understanding her. "Maggie," he repeated softly, as if trying to grasp the full meaning of what she was telling him. She met his gaze, her eyes filled with something raw fear, regret, and a deep, unspoken pain. She paused for a long moment, her fingers trembling, as she wrapped them around the edges of her coat, a nervous habit that had become more apparent in the days they had spent together. Finally, her voice broke the stillness once again. "I'm running from my husband," she confessed, the words falling from her lips like a heavy burden being released. The rancher felt a sharp pang of disbelief and sorrow, his mind struggling to process her words. Maggie's husband was a powerful man, a figure known in the nearby town for his wealth and influence. The rancher had heard his name before, but he never imagined that someone like Maggie could be connected to him. She continued, her voice trembling. "He's abusive, he's done terrible things to me, and I fear for my life. That's why I had to leave." The rancher's chest tightened as the weight of her confession settled in. All of the pieces fell into place, the fear in her eyes, the urgency of her departure, the reason she couldn't speak. She had been running for her life, and the storm had been the least of her worries. The realization hit him hard. Maggie wasn't just another lost soul seeking refuge in the wilderness. She was a woman fighting for her survival, hiding from a man who would stop at nothing to find her. The rancher felt his stomach twist with a mixture of anger and sympathy. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the man who had caused her so much pain. But as much as he wanted to help, he also knew that he was now entangled in a dangerous game, one where the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Maggie's life was in danger, and by helping her, he was risking his own. He couldn't bring himself to turn her away. He had seen enough of her suffering to know that she wasn't exaggerating, that the terror in her eyes was real. The rancher felt a deep sense of responsibility stirring within him, a primal need to defend her from the monster she was running from. But as he looked at her, he couldn't help but think of his own past, his own battles with loss, his struggles to survive. What would he do if it were his own daughter, his own flesh and blood, running from a man like that? The question haunted him, and he knew there was no easy answer. But now, with Maggie standing before him, vulnerable and broken, he felt a surge of protectiveness like he had never experienced before. "Stay here," the rancher said, his voice firm, though his mind was racing. "You don't have to go anywhere. You're safe here. With me, I'll help you." The words felt strange as they left his mouth, a promise that now tied him to something he hadn't anticipated. He had never been one to get involved in other people's problems. He had learned long ago to keep his distance. But Maggie was different. The connection that had formed between them in the silence, in the unspoken understanding, had drawn him in, and now he couldn't turn away. He had made his choice, and he knew there was no going back. Maggie's eyes softened as she met his gaze, her face a mixture of relief and wariness. She hadn't trusted anyone in so long, and yet, here was this man, this rancher, offering her sanctuary. But she wasn't foolish. She knew that accepting his help meant involving him in her nightmare, pulling him into the very danger she was running from. Yet, as she looked at him, something in her began to shift. The walls she had built around herself started to crack, and she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was someone who could help her, someone who wasn't afraid to fight for her, even at great personal cost. But the rancher was now caught between his own past and the present, between the man he had been and the man he needed to be to protect her. The question was no longer whether he could protect her. It was whether he was ready to face the darkness that was sure to come. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the ranch shrouded in a heavy darkness that matched the unease settling in the pit of the rancher's stomach. He had been expecting them, but the moment they rode up, it felt as though the weight of inevitability crushed down on him. The two men from earlier returned, but this time their demeanor was different, darker, more forceful. They dismounted from their horses with purpose, their eyes scanning the ranch with a predatory gaze. The rancher stood at the doorway, his hand resting on the rifle at his side, every muscle tense. He knew this confrontation was unavoidable, but he wasn't ready to give in. He couldn't, not with Maggie inside. The taller of the two men stepped forward, his voice cold as he addressed the rancher. "We know she's here," he said, his tone unmistakably threatening. "We don't want trouble, we just want her. Hand her over, and no one gets hurt." The rancher's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at the two men, sizing them up. They were both much larger than him, but he had something they didn't, his resolve. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't let them take her, not after everything she had told him. The rancher held his ground, his voice steady as he replied, "She's not going anywhere. You can leave now, or things are going to get ugly." The tension between the men was palpable, thickening the air around them. The rancher could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but the fear of losing Maggie was worse. He glanced back toward the guest room where Maggie remained hidden, her presence like a weight on his heart. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe from the man who had tormented her. But standing there, facing these two men, the reality of that promise felt heavier than ever. Maggie's life was at stake, and he wasn't sure if he could protect her from the danger they represented. As the rancher held his stance, the two men closed in. The taller one took another step forward, his voice now a growl. "You don't want to make this harder than it needs to be. We'll find her eventually, but the longer you make this difficult, the worse it'll be for you." In that moment, the rancher made his choice. He couldn't afford to be passive anymore. He reached for his rifle, the weight of the weapon comforting in his hands. The men paused, their eyes narrowing as they recognized the shift in his demeanor. But there was no turning back now, this was it. A fight was inevitable, and the rancher was ready to face it head-on before he could fully raise the rifle. One of the men lunged forward, knocking it from his hands. The rancher reacted instinctively, landing a solid punch to the man's jaw, sending him staggering back. The taller man, furious now, drew a knife from his belt and advanced with dangerous speed. The fight erupted with a ferocity that sent adrenaline coursing through the rancher's veins. Every blow, every move was a struggle for survival, not just his own, but Maggie's too. His thoughts were focused on one thing only, keeping her safe. But with every passing second, he could feel the danger growing more intense. He had no idea if he could hold them off long enough. Maggie's voice broke through the chaos. "Stop, please, stop," she cried from the doorway, her body trembling. The rancher's heart tightened at the sound of her fear. In that moment, his resolve solidified. He couldn't let this escalate any further. He had to end it. He fought harder, using every ounce of strength to disarm the man with the knife, finally sending him crashing to the ground. The taller man was still standing, but the rancher was more determined than ever. He could feel the fight coursing through him, the fear of losing Maggie propelling him forward. It wasn't just about survival, it was about saving her, no matter the cost. With a final, brutal move, the rancher tackled the last man to the ground, pinning him with all his weight. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching from the fight, but he didn't let go. The man struggled beneath him, but the rancher held firm. "This ends now," he growled. The words were simple, but they carried all the weight of the promise he had made to Maggie. He wasn't going to let anyone take her from him. The rancher's grip tightened as he looked over his shoulder to check on Maggie. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale with fear, but filled with something else, relief. The rancher's heart hammered in his chest. As the man beneath him finally stopped struggling, he had won for now. The rancher stood up slowly, his body exhausted but his resolve stronger than ever. He looked at the men, who were now crawling away, defeated but alive. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. As the men retreated, the rancher turned back to Maggie, who had stepped forward, her eyes filled with gratitude and something deeper, something he hadn't expected. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The rancher nodded, but his thoughts were already racing. He had made a choice, and it was one that would change everything. From this moment on, nothing would be the same. He had risked everything to protect her, and now, he knew that he couldn't stop, not until the danger was gone. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape untouched by chaos, the snow covering the ground in a quiet frozen blanket. The rancher stood by the window, watching the world outside as the first rays of morning sunlight began to break through the clouds. The wind had died down, and the world felt still, almost serene in its silence. The violence of the previous night had left him exhausted both physically and emotionally, but there was a strange peace in the calm that followed. He turned back to the cabin, his eyes meeting Maggie's. She was standing by the fire, her face a mixture of gratitude and weariness. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was no fear in her eyes. She was safe for now. Maggie looked up at him, her gaze soft, almost fragile. There was something different about her now, no longer the broken woman who had arrived in the storm, but someone who had fought and survived. The rancher could see the change in her, the way the weight of her past had begun to lift. She wasn't free from it, but there was hope in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. He had promised to protect her, and in that promise, he had found a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. But now, as they stood there, the silence between them spoke volumes. It wasn't just the storm that had ended, it was the tension, the unspoken fear that had lingered between them since their first encounter. For the rancher, the silence felt different now. It was no longer oppressive or lonely. It was a companion, something that allowed him to process the whirlwind of emotions and decisions that had come with protecting Maggie. He had lived in isolation for so long, thinking he had everything under control. But with her in his life, things were changing. She had entered his world like a storm. And now, as the aftermath settled in, he realized that his life was no longer just about survival. It was about connection, about the bond they had formed in the most unexpected of circumstances. But was he ready for this? For the responsibility of protecting someone who had become more important to him than he ever expected? Maggie's voice broke the silence, her words soft but full of emotion. "Now, I can breathe," she said, her eyes meeting his with a depth of gratitude that left him speechless. The rancher's heart tightened at her words. She had been living in fear for so long, running from a man who had stripped her of her peace. And now, here she was finally able to take in a breath without the weight of that fear bearing down on her. It wasn't just the storm that had passed. It was the years of pain, of running, of never feeling safe. And in that moment, the rancher realized that he had given her something far more important than shelter. He had given her the freedom to live again. As Maggie settled into the quiet of the room, the rancher took a deep breath, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions inside him. He had risked everything to protect her, but it wasn't just about duty or obligation anymore. Something had shifted in him, something he hadn't fully understood until now. He had always prided himself on his solitude, on the independence he had cultivated over the years. But now, with Maggie here, there was a new kind of peace. Not the kind that came from being alone, but the kind that came from knowing you weren't truly alone. He had found something more than survival. He had found connection, something that had eluded him for so long. The quiet between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after the storm, the kind that feels like a new beginning. The rancher stepped closer to the fire, his eyes never leaving Maggie. He could sense the weight of her past, the memories that still haunted her. But for the first time, he saw hope in her eyes. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor, and she had chosen to stay. He had given her protection, but she had given him something too, a reason to fight for something beyond himself. Something beyond the land he had always claimed as his own. Maggie looked at him again, her expression softening. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly, her voice full of sincerity. "You've saved my life." The rancher shook his head, his lips pressing into a tight line. "I didn't do it for thanks," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. He didn't need her gratitude. What mattered was that she was here, safe, and that he had kept his promise. But as he stood there, a part of him wondered if there was more to this than just saving her from danger. Had he been looking for something too, something he hadn't even known he needed? Outside, the sun rose higher, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered landscape. The world was still peaceful, as though the chaos of the past few days had never happened. But the rancher knew better. Things had changed. He had changed, and Maggie, though still fragile, had begun to heal. They had faced the storm together, and though there were more challenges ahead, there was something in the air, something unspoken but real, that told him they would face whatever came next, side by side. The rancher had spent years living in silence, but now, in this quiet, he realized that it wasn't the silence of solitude he feared. It was the silence of not knowing what he was truly living for. As the day unfolded, the rancher knew that this peace would not last forever. The world was full of dangers, and Maggie's past would catch up to them eventually. But for now, they had this moment, a moment of stillness, of safety. For now, that was enough. Maggie had found the peace she had longed for, and in her quiet gratitude, the rancher had found something he hadn't known he was missing. In the silence of the new dawn, they both breathed easier. And for the first time, the rancher understood that some battles were worth fighting. Not for survival alone, but for something more, a future worth living. As the hours passed, the rancher couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of uncertainty. He had made the decision to protect Maggie, to risk his life for hers, but the weight of what lay ahead was heavy on his mind. The world outside might be calm now, but he knew that peace was fragile. Maggie's past wasn't something that could be erased easily, and the shadow of her abusive husband would always be lurking, waiting to find her. Yet there was something different now. The fear that had once consumed her had begun to fade, replaced by a quiet strength. She was no longer the broken woman who had arrived at his doorstep. She was beginning to rebuild herself, piece by piece, and the rancher found himself feeling a sense of pride in her resilience. As he looked out over the land, the rancher couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed. He had spent so many years in isolation, believing that he was content with the solitude that the ranch provided. But now, with Maggie by his side, he realized that what he had mistaken for peace was merely the absence of connection. He had always found solace in the quiet, but it had never felt this fulfilling. Maggie had brought something into his life that he hadn't known. He was missing: purpose, warmth, and a sense of belonging. It was a feeling that both terrified and exhilarated him. Could he truly open himself up to someone else again? Was he ready to share his life with her, even with the dangers that still loomed? Maggie too was grappling with her own internal struggle. For so long, she had been running, hiding from the monster her life had become. But now, with the rancher's protection and the calm of the snow-covered ranch surrounding her, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had always been afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of allowing someone to truly see her pain. But the rancher had seen her at her lowest, had listened without judgment, and had given her the space to heal. She could breathe now, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to imagine a future where fear no longer controlled her. Yet, even as she savored this new sense of safety, the reality of their situation lingered. Maggie knew that the man who had tormented her would not rest until he found her. The rancher had made her feel safe, but she couldn't forget that the danger was still out there. As much as she wanted to believe that they could build a new life together, a life free from the shadows of the past, she knew it wasn't that simple. There were still battles to be fought, and the threat was real. But for now, in the quiet of the ranch, she allowed herself the luxury of hope. She had found something worth fighting for. Something that went beyond survival. She had found love, and with it, the strength to face whatever came next. Asterisk, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snow, the rancher and Maggie stood side by side, watching the horizon. The future was uncertain, but in that moment they were together, and that was enough. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a team. The storm had passed, but the journey was far from over. They both knew that the path forward would be difficult, but for the first time they had something more than just survival to cling to each other. And in the silence of the new dawn, they both understood that love, in all its forms, was worth a fight.